Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our webinar program. Tonight's webinar program is sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action, the Community Church of Boston, and the Smedley Butler Brigade Chapter 9 Veterans for Peace. So thank you so much to our sponsors for putting this together. And thank you to all of us for joining this program. Thank you to all of you for joining this program tonight. I'm really excited for our program tonight. It's titled Ray McGovern on Russia and Ukraine and the US. So our speaker, Ray McGovern, asked me to keep the introduction brief. So here goes. Ray did the CIA morning briefings for Vice President George H.W. Bush and chaired the National Intelligence Estimates. After Ray retired, he co-created the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity as a corrective to the fraud that has overtaken intelligence analysis. The Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity were reporting correctly before the catastrophes of Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were correct again in exposing the fraud of Russiagate. This was before the story gathered steam and painted Vladimir Putin as the devil incarnate. Analyzing Russia and Ukraine over the past few months, Ray has found himself once again pretty much an outlier, but so far so good. Thanks for being with us, Ray.
You're most welcome, and hello everyone. I feel I know many of you, and I have to start out on a uncertain note, like an uncertain trumpet. The New York Times and others are streaming what's going on in Ukraine. And here I have the latest from the New York Times, filed within the hour, which says in effect that the authorities in Donetsk and Lugansk have requested help from Russia. And Putin is deciding whether to honor those requests. I thought he already sent troops in there. Could it be that we've sanctioned him? Are these preemptive sanctions? I mean, if the president is wrong and Blinken is wrong and Scholz in Germany is wrong, in other words, if there are no Russian troops that have gone over the border, well, these sanctions are in reaction to something that might happen. It could happen tomorrow, but apparently Putin has not yet authorized it, has not replied for that kind of help from Donetsk and Lugansk. The other thing is that most of these reports, including President Biden's words, predated the official approval by the Russian parliament for such steps. Now, whatever you think of Putin, he's legally trained, and he tries to observe these legal niceties. So my view is that, yeah, Russian troops are going probably going into Donetsk and Lugansk, but it's sort of odd that they haven't done so yet. And what will control all this will be the behavior of the Ukrainian forces that have been shelling the separatists, so-called, in Lugansk and in Donetsk, shelling them to a fare thee well for the last week or so. So this is all very fluid, and it reminds me of one of my favorite persons, Yul Brynner. Do you remember him in The King and I? There are times I'm not so sure of my life, but I did absolutely know. Very often find confusion with conclusion I concluded long ago. It goes on like that. So I wanted to start this little seminar off on a subjunctive mood, so to speak, where everything we're saying is if what? If the Russians invade, or have the Russians invade, was this an invasion? Or, it's really pretty crazy. And as a friend of mine who knows a lot about Russia kind of reprimanded me today, he said, Ray, why do you ask whether we should believe the authorities in Lugansk and Donetsk and the authorities in Moscow, just because they differ from the authorities in Washington. Do you still believe this stuff coming out from Washington? I'm surprised at you, Ray. So bottom line, it is confusing. It's a Yul Brynner type situation. We have to keep our powder dry and figure out what really the stakes are for Russia, for China, for the US, and for NATO. Now, one of my major themes in writing about this over the last couple of months is something called the correlation of forces. The old Soviets used to call it the world correlation of forces. Now, it's not a graduate degree concept, right? It's sort of elementary school. Correlation of forces, Stalin made a big thing of saying, if the correlation of forces is not in your favor, don't attack. Okay? If the correlation of forces is in your favor, that's the time to be very active, to attack if you must, but to defend themselves aggressively. Now, what do we have here? We have a situation where over the last decade, we have frittered away our relationship with both China and Russia. And whereas in the old days, the Chinese and the Russians didn't have much sympathy for each other, were actually at loggerheads, and not just ideologically. Full disclosure, I should tell you that my first portfolio as a CIA analyst was one containing the Sino-Soviet dispute, the dispute between Russia and China. Most people didn't believe it was real at that time. We're talking the early 60s. And you had to persuade people, and it was really, really hard. One thing we adduced as a sign that the Russians and the Chinese really didn't get along is you might be interested in this. It was sort of a peripheral thing, but we found out that the Russians were broadcasting revolutionary, incendiary, inciting things to China, to Xinjiang in Uyghurs, we know about now, right? Okay, that was my first knowledge about Uyghurs. And we had only one person in the United States that could translate Uyghur for us, and he got sick. So we have to find somebody else. So, well, what am I saying here? I'm saying that it was really crucial for us to know that the Chinese were insurrecting, so to speak, not the Chinese, the Russians were trying to cause insurrections in Xinjiang. Then we found 15, would you believe, 15 Soviet divisions on the Chinese border? Well, believe it because we had the images, we had the pictures, okay? And we were able to play China off against Russia because China was deathly afraid that those 15 divisions multiplied, that the Russians were about to use them against China. And that was part of the play which made it possible for the US, I'm talking about Kissinger and Nixon, to play off Russia against China and achieve really important things. A rapprochement with China on the one hand, and the conclusion of very significant arms control treaties with Russia on the other. Now, I was very fortunate in having a catbird seat, actually, watching the unfolding of the so-called the SALT agreements, strategic arms limitation talks agreements. And by that time, I had become a branch chief of the Soviet foreign policy branch at CIA. And I had three people that I seconded, one to the delegations, which met in Helsinki or Vienna, the other to the military experts to coordinate with them, the third to report to the director and people in Washington as what was going. And I had the pleasure or the privilege of being there when those documents were signed. Now, why do I mention that? I mention that because, well, I come out of the real old school, right? And I mean, this old school had desks, and this old school had floors under desks. And that's where I ended up when we had these drills to protect ourselves from the radioactivity from Russian atomic bombs. And I spent my youth walking around New York and saying, my God, don't they believe? Don't they understand that if they build yet another one of those buildings, one mistake and it's all gone? So I lived in this perpetual fear, really, that all this stuff could blow up immediately. And when I started working as an analyst, trying to figure out whether the Russians serious about reaching agreement, we agreed they were. That was big, because there are lots of people who would say, no, they're just checking us for a long ride and off a short pier, right? So, and when we were able to facilitate the achievement of this SALT treaty. Now, SALT, again, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the ABM Treaty for Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that was the key to stability for the next 3 decades, 1972 until 2002. Now, given my anguished youth, think of how, what's the word, exuberant I was, sitting there in Moscow saying, wow, not only are we spared all this anxiety for as long as this works, but you even played a role in it, McGovern. Yeah, this was delightful. This was really something. So fast forward, and George W. Bush decides, well, we don't need that treaty. We're going to get out of that treaty. And so in 2002, the US, without any explanation, simply leaves the linchpin, the cornerstone of strategic stability. Now, for those of you who coming at this a little bit new, it simply meant that we could only build one ABM site, anti-ballistic missile site, in each country. And so there was no way anyone could prevent a retaliatory attack with just one anti-ballistic missile system. And so that was sort of the balance of terror there. No one would dare mount a first strike. Footnote, did the Russians cheat? Well, were we asked about this by Nixon and Kissinger? We sure were. It said, doverai no proverai, trust but verify. That started with Nixon and Kissinger, not with Reagan. They said, if we trust these guys, these were not pleasant people. This is Brezhnev, Kosygin, Shiliepin. These were tough guys. Can we trust them? Can you verify if we trust them? And we said, well, how soon will we have to verify a violation? And the answer was, well, maybe 2 weeks. So we said, yeah, we can do that. Did they cheat? Yeah. Anybody know? Yeah, they cheated. The Russians did, and we caught them within 2 weeks. By the way, it was 1987. Reagan was president, and they were building. The Russians were out in the midst of Siberia. Krasnoyarsk was the name of the place, and they had this incredible big radar that could only be for anti-ballistic missile purposes. So we called them on it. They said, no, that's not for. So what's it for? Well, in those days, now get a hold of this, folks. In those days, we used to sit down around a table. We used to show intelligence that showed their violations, and we used to negotiate. Okay, negotiate. And so we did. Took 6 years, but finally the Soviets said, all right, that's it. All right, it's an ABM radar. We'll tear it down. So when Reagan first said, tear it down, that was the Berlin Wall. Before that, Nixon, or Reagan actually, had said, tear this one down. This just by way of saying that verification is terribly important here. It allows these things and allows people to have some confidence that these things will be observed. Now, one of the counter offers that the U.S. has made to Russia in these negotiations that started in early January was to begin negotiating on intermediate range ballistic missiles in the eastern part of Europe, which can be used to threaten the Russian ICBM force and other strategic facilities that the Russians have in their European part of Russia. And guess what? The US went a step farther and said, and we'll allow a verification. We'll allow what they call transparency, and we'll allow people come into your sites in Romania and Poland, and we'll have to be able to come into your sites. So this is a major step. What Putin and Lavrov call this is a subordinate or a secondary issue to the one about NATO and Ukraine. Now, I would like to turn specifically to Ukraine now, with this background of the Soviets, stoking their chin and saying, why did they exit the ABM treaty? And then why did they exit in 1987 the treaty that limited intermediate range ballistic missiles, which threatened each side from Europe with only maybe 9 or 10 minutes for launch to target time, okay? 9 minutes to decide whether to destroy the world. Now, this was amazing, folks. I never thought it would happen, but the Russians with their SS-20s and the Americans with our Pershing IIs in Western Europe destroyed a whole class of nuclear weapons, missiles. Now, some of my friends were there to observe, to verify, to not trust but verify the agreement that these things really were destroyed. Now, what's his name? Trump got out of that treaty. Why? No explanation. So here are the Russians trying to figure out what's going on here. Don't they realize that this was the key stabilizing factor? I wonder what they have up their sleeve. And then they start watching the building of so-called ABM missiles sites in Poland and Romania. Now, this clip that I'd like to show you comes out of a meeting, let's see, about 5-6 years ago, where Putin took advantage of the presence of Western correspondents, Western media people in St. Petersburg, and tried to give them some sense. Whoops, wait a second. I guess, yeah, some sense. Am I showing the wrong video? Yeah, let's start with this one now. Tried to give them some sense of what the stakes were for him, and got very little help, got very little interest. All he got was, oh, well, that's really interesting, to show how fixated Putin was on this issue. And again, that was, I think, 2017. May we have that video, please?
Can you guys hear the sound?
I have no sound.
Calla, you might have to unmute.
This is about a minute long, and it shows Putin very uncharacteristically losing his cool. He's talking to Western journalists. They don't get it, okay? They have no idea how the Russians look at this as a threat to their national security, as a threat to their retaliatory capability if these missile defense systems are able to squelch their offensive capability with their ICBM. So watch this next thing, and you'll see from this segment, which I hope will go on just a few seconds now, how Putin really is kind of beside himself, because as you can see, some of these Western journalists say, oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah. So let's have that second clip, please.
Угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне ссылаясь на якобы имеющуюся иранскую ядерную угрозу при строительстве системы ПРО. Ну так оно и есть на самом деле. В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему, сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется для пусков ракет средней дальности «Томагавк» морского базирования. Туда закладывают сейчас антиракеты, способные поражать цели на расстоянии 500 километров. Но мы знаем, технологии развиваются. Мы примерно знаем, в каком году примерно американцы получат новую ракету, которая будет уже не 500 километров, а 1000, а потом больше. И с этого момента они начнут угрожать нашему ядерному потенциалу. Мы по годам знаем, что будет происходить. И они знают, что мы знаем. Это вам только вешают лапшу на уши, как у нас говорят, а вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться.
So there you have it, you know. What's the matter with you folks? Why can't you understand this? And he's talking to the journalists, of course, and you can't see any rational discussion of this in Western media. The Russian. Thanks very much. That's exactly what I wanted to show. You see, Putin is talking about defending his country. The balance of power has just changed. There is no ABM treaty anymore, and there's no INF treaty. And what is there? There is the emplacement of missiles in Poland and Romania that are called anti-ballistic missiles because they're devised to defend against whom? Iran, right? And at one point we said, no, it's North Korea, right? Well, you know, one look at the globe will suggest that these are tall tales indeed. So they were meant against Russia. And were they meant as ABM sites? Well, as Putin himself points out there, and he's done so several times later, this time in public, the capsules, the holes in the ground, or the holes into which these so-called ABM interceptors fit are exactly the same diameter as the ones necessary to fire what Putin calls Tomahawk missiles, right? Now, Tomahawk missiles, these are a real threat to the Russian retaliatory capability. And the ones that fly even faster than those cruise missiles, these supersonic or ultrasonic weapons that fly several times the speed of sound, they give Putin, well, he says explicitly, they give me 7 minutes from these sites, if and when they're in place, 7 minutes to decide the equivalent of whether I destroy the rest of the world, okay? Now, if they're hypersonic missiles, which the US will have in a couple of years, we have them now, says Putin, then I only have 5 minutes. I don't want to have just 5 minutes to decide whether I'm being attacked with nuclear weapons. So on this, what's called now a secondary issue, he's been fixated on it, and I'm sure there will be an opening for negotiations there. Now that the US, we know the US position because of a leak to El País, the Spanish newspaper, the US has come back and said, yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, and we can talk about inspections too. In other words, we can get back to the INF treaty, the Treaty on Intermediate Nuclear Forces. I think that I jumped the gun here, and I was going to show this last one first, but if we could have the first one now. The first video shows, for anybody who had any doubts, how the coup in Kiev happened on the 22nd of February. Wait a second, what's today? Did anyone observe the anniversary of the coup in Kiev on February 22nd, 2014? I wonder why not. Let's have this video. Thank you very much.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Kleitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Kleitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. You know, I just think Kleitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a 3-way, you know, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three. And it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, okay. I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me VFR saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay. She talked to Sullivan. Who's Sullivan? That's Jake Sullivan. Used to work for Biden. What did Sullivan say? Well, Biden knows all about this and he's ready to come in to solidify this thing. So Biden knew what was going on. So did Sullivan. That's Victoria Nuland, the the grande dame who is running this coup, she is the one that appeared on the Maidan, the big square there in Kiev, handing out cookies. And we know that lots of money was also handed out. That was the coup that George Friedman, who used to head Stratfor, which used to be a decent organization, he called it the most blatant coup in history. And he was exactly right. Now, apologists for Nuland and for the people she picked, like Timothy Snyder, he's a professor at Yale. Amy had him on with me early on here, and I couldn't believe, I didn't do enough research as to who I'd be debating. I couldn't believe he was denying that this was significant. And so I said, well, we had that intercepted conversation where they're plotting the coup, and he says, so that's all you got? That's all you got? You know? And I should have said, well, I've been doing this kind of stuff for decades. I know what a coup looks like, but never before have I seen it advertised 2.5 weeks beforehand. But Amy cut me off and went to hit for another question. He's got a big op-ed coming up tomorrow. You might want to take a look at it. So anyhow, we have this coup that was orchestrated. Now, what's the key here? The key here is that with Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, our ambassador in Kiev, careless about what they said over an open phone, it got intercepted. Who intercepted it? I don't know. Could have been the Russians, could have been anybody. It was an open phone, okay? And somebody thought it would be really nice to post it on YouTube, which they did on the 4th of February, 2014. When did I say the coup was? The 22nd of February, 2014. So my initial reaction, having listened to the YouTube, was, oh, poor Yats. The fellow they picked, Yats is the guy, Yatsenyuk. Poor Yats, he's all prepared to be prime minister. That can't happen now. The operation's been blown, but that's not the way it is anymore. He survived and he became prime minister. He threatened to join NATO right away, and he also tried to forbid or to say that Russian could no longer be an official language in Ukraine. Those are strong words and strong moves. This provoked a lot of attention, of course, and the Crimeans decided, the Crimeans decided that they wanted to rejoin Russia. That's a long story, but they did. Now, Putin, in his major speech just a couple of days ago, calls attention to the massacre of pro-Russian Ukrainians in Odessa, in southern Ukraine. It was brutal. The fascists or the pro-Nazis chased a lot of these people into the trade union building, set it afire. It was the 2nd of May, 2014. I think there were about 40 died. As many more died later, and then there were about 120 other casualties. It's all on film, or it was. It's hard to find now. Google won't help you find us anymore, but it's all out there, okay? And Putin refers to this as a really unimaginable tragedy, and no one's looking for the perpetrators, but we'll find them and we'll bring them to justice. Whoa. Now, I don't think that's a sign he's going to invade Ukraine, but it is a sign that he's real serious about protecting people who are only guilty of speaking Russian or being of Russian heritage. So what else? Well, I would just say, and trying to close up here, that the negotiation path is still open. Both sides still say that. Will Putin invade in the traditional sense Ukraine with all these forces he has assembled around Ukraine? My best guess is he will not. They will achieve their purpose quite well by not invading Ukraine. Last thing, and perhaps the most important thing, Putin has an ace in the hole, okay? And what's that ace called? China. China is in a virtual military alliance with Russia. And, the story is an interesting one. This has been, the relations have been improving for decades, but never more than when it started last year. What started last year? Well, the first time that Biden got a little spooked by all those Russian forces around Ukraine, reacting to what the president of Ukraine said was an operation to take back Crimea and the eastern provinces. That's what those Russian troops were doing. Biden called Putin, and they decided they'd have a summit in June. It happened on the 16th of June. After the summit, Biden's getting on the plane, and he says, I probably shouldn't divulge our conversations, but, Putin's got a real problem with China. They're squeezing him, There's this monstrous long border with China, and China decided it's going to be not only an economic power, but a primary military power. So this is a real worry for Putin. In other words, we got the upper hand here, and partly because Putin has other problems, big ones with China. Nothing could have been farther from the mark. I dare say I would love to have been a fly on the wall to see what Putin and Lavrov said to each other after that. Where does this guy is 3 decades behind the times. And so, long story short, Putin and Xi, President Xi of China, did their best over the next half year and now into this year to show that their alliance is really, really tight. That, in their words, it exceeds in closeness and effectiveness a traditional alliance. Now, why is that important? Well, if you think of it, you don't have to know a lot about Soviet terminology, but they were really big on the world correlation of forces. Not a big deal. Anybody can understand it. I think I mentioned it before. So the correlation of forces, which used to be an equilateral triangle, okay, now has become an isosceles triangle. For those of you who remember your geometry, and the short end is the United States. And whether Blinken and Sullivan and Biden still understand that or not, our military does understand it, okay? Our military, however, I don't want to use adjectives, however much they had to grovel to get a 4th star, they're still pretty smart. And even for another star, I doubt whether they would risk war on 2 fronts against 2 formidable enemies. So Biden has really got himself into a bind, so to speak, Biden's bind, and he's getting no help from, one last comment, Blinken. Well, I don't know what to say about this Secretary of State. The most recent ones haven't been all that stellar, but Blinken doesn't even take the trouble to learn how to pronounce things. Like the Russian foreign minister. Most of you know his name. I asked a radio personality one time who was interviewing me, who should know how to pronounce the Russian foreign minister's last name best of all? And he said, well, his wife. I said, all right, after that. Blinken. So what does Blinken say? Sergei Lavrov. I met with Sergei Lavrov, and Lavrov said this to me, Lavrov. It's not Lavrov, it's Lavrov. I mean, you would think that it's more than a diplomatic nicety to know how to pronounce your interlocutor's last name. And to finish up, I'm going to finish up on a slightly lighter note, because I hope that Tony Blinken is tuned in here. I have reason to believe he is. He usually watches my performances. And I want to teach him how to pronounce the word Ukraine, okay? Some of you may have noticed he says Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Well, Tony, it's Ukraine, and maybe you can join me in this chorus of trying to persuade Tony there's a mnemonic. It's really easy to remember. You ready? The rain in Spain falls mainly in Ukraine. Everyone, come on. The rain in Spain falls mainly in Ukraine. Well, we have a couple of clowns running our foreign policy. We have a couple of military that know which is end up. They can't win a war, but they can certainly avoid a war with two major powers. And we have a person in the person of the president of Russia, who I will tell you, I believe is prudent, is smart, does not do aggressive things unless he's really forced to it, and is motivated first and foremost by defending his country. Now, people say, well, no, he's motivated by dissolving NATO. Well, yeah, it'd be nice. That's sort of collateral damage for Putin. NATO is going to dissolve anyway. The question is whether he can assert his newfound strength with his alliance with President Xi of China and make it stick that no longer will they tolerate US encroachment into areas where they will give Putin only 5 minutes to decide whether he's under nuclear attack or not. I'll finish there, and I really will welcome your questions.
Great, thanks so much, Ray. I can't wait to rewatch the video. There's so much material there, so a very dense material. Can't wait to rewatch it. I just want to say a word quickly about the format of the event. We're planning to go until around 9 p.m. And between now and then, the rest of the time, we'll be giving Ray questions. I'm working with a team of moderators, including Steve, Elizaveta, and Calla, to co-moderate tonight's event, and we have prepared questions. And if people have questions they want to ask Ray, they could put them in the chat, and we'll monitor them, and we'll try to get we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can tonight. Okay, so Ray, we had some questions in the chat. For people who are not super familiar with this topic, could you elaborate a little more? Could you give us a little bit more historical context about Ukraine and the different languages they speak there, the different issues going on in Ukraine, and in particular the 2014 coup, like the US-backed coup? Why did the US do that, and what relevance does it have, like particularly to what's happening right now?
Well, Ukraine is the heartland of the Slavic people. Without going into too much detail, I think it sets some context to realize that Russian history only goes back to the 9th century. Okay, in the 900s, the Slavic people that inhabited that area around Kiev and up in the Pripyat marshes around what is now Belarus, they had a burgeoning culture. They had a good literature. They had epic poems akin to Aeneid or one of Homer's. One was Slova Apokoligreje, but they had no written language. Imagine. no written language. So think about the Chinese, think about the Persians or the Egyptians, or or the Celts, which of course came first. They had no written language. So what happened was two Greek priests went up there, really enjoyed and trying to help these people to fashion a language. They constructed one. They manufactured one. They used Greek letters. They used Latin letters. They used Hebrew letters that they knew about. And there were some sounds like that they had to manufacture a letter. But they gave them a written language. And that became Old Church Slavonic. It gradually became Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian. And in the 10th century, the Prince of Kiev, Kiev and Rus, decided, well, this is really great. We'll have a culture now. We'll become Christian because that's the thing to do now. And so they all went down to the Dnieper River and they got baptized one Sunday afternoon. And of course, they became Eastern Orthodox Christians later when there was the big schism. So what happened after that? Well, Russian history is a pretty sad one because not long after that, the Tatars, Genghis Khan invaded from the east. For 220 years, he ruled most of what was Russia. And it was a hell of a time for the Russian people until they got rid of him. As soon as they got rid of him, the Russians were invaded by the Hanseatic League, by the Poles, by the Swedes. And it wasn't until late that Peter the Great was able to consolidate and bring some civilization to Russia. Then, of course, you had Napoleon invading in the early 19th century and Hitler in the 20th century. In the 20th century, World War II, the Russians really beat the Germans and lost 27 million people. By contrast, the United States lost 400,000. Now, 400,000 is a lot. 27 million is much more. So that's what they come out of. So they're a little sensitive about Ukraine, where some of these invasions took place. They're a little sensitive about people who don't like Russia being right on their border. So fast forwarding to Victoria Nuland, well, she was working for Hillary Clinton at first, and then she took over. She worked for actually, what's his name? The guy who was our vice president, Dick Cheney. She was his national security advisor deputy. Okay, and that's where she got her spurs. Okay, so she hates Russia. It's very clear, and she not only is rabid, but she's naive. Rabid because she said 2 months ago, we're going to get sanctions and we're going to stop Nord Stream 2. And I can explain what that is later. Nord Stream 2 is going to be this big sanction. And as soon as the Russians invade Ukraine, that's going to go in. Okay. And then when it looked like the Russians are really threatening to invade Ukraine, she goes to the Chinese, mind you. She goes to the Chinese and says, oh, would you help us restrain the Russians? Because they're acting very belligerently in Europe. The Chinese say, hey, Victoria, see one of our people in the embassy, and he or she will explain to you what's really going on. So it's Victoria Nuland, and it's that business behind her. Not only Russian haters, whether real or whether genuine or just educated to hate Russians, but it's also what I call the Mickey Mat. If you got a pencil, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. They're running things in Washington, and there can be no success for the Mickey Mat absent a credible enemy. And Russia has served that purpose very well. They continue to serve that purpose. And the way Russia has been demonized over the last 5 years, at least, has facilitated these people to try to move a little bit farther than Putin is going to allow them to.
Thanks, Ray and Elizabeth.
Hi. Before I ask our next question, I want to introduce myself. I am an intern from Northeastern, but I'm also originally from Russia and live in Moscow. And the situation right now is quite alarming. So one question that I wanted to ask is, so the media recently, the headlines have been Russia is about to invade Ukraine. That was about 2 weeks ago. Or even Bloomberg posted for like 30 minutes, Russia already invaded Ukraine. And all those headlines that are like alarming the public even more. So the question is, why has the US political media and like establishment been so alarmist in their claims of supposed Russian invasion? Because it makes people more worried.
Mm-hmm. Well, это большой шум из ничего. It's a storm in Wasserglas. It's what's the English? It's a tempest in a teapot. Okay, but it serves a really good purpose. Now, when I said Mickey Mouse, military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, as if in all caps. Okay, why media before academia and think tank? Because media is the key. The media works for those same multinational corporations. You can't do it without the media. The media, well, I'm talking about the establishment media now, of course, independent media, such as it is, such as we are tonight, is much more powerful if we can get our act together. But the established media just sees a lot of profits. I mean, we had a report slipped into the media that Raytheon and Lockheed have written letters to their stockholders. Tension in Ukraine bodes very favorably for our bottom line. It's going to look really good this year. Okay, that's the name of the game. And there are lots of examples of that. And even, even that head of CBS once said, well, we knew that giving so much time and attention to Donald Trump was was not good for the country, but sure good for our bottom line. So here it is. It's this. And when you look at the congressional people, such as they are, the idea is they need to win elections, right? Or they need to stay in office. And for that, they need lots of money, okay? So where do they get lots of money? They get lots of money from the arms manufacturers and the arms dealers, okay? How did they do that? They approve, they appropriate money, and that builds these things, and then they sell them, and then the people who profiteer on all this stuff save some, and they put it in the pockets of the Congress people, and the Congress people appropriate more money for the next year. I mean, is this a great country or what? I don't usually quote popes, but Pope Francis had it right when he stood before Congress. I don't know if you remember what he said, but he said, the main problem is the blood-soaked arms trade. Blood-soaked arms trade. Immediately, all the senators and representatives got up, and then they looked in their pockets to make sure that the latest envelope from Raytheon and Lockheed was still there, I mean, it was giving hypocrisy a bad name. So I'm afraid that explains a lot of what's going on. And politics, of course, is another part of this. People would justifiably think that Biden thinks he has to be really, really tough now vis-a-vis Russia, or else they're going to lose pretty bad in the midterms. And that may be true. I don't know. That's not my beat. But if that works that way, it will be no surprise to Mr. Putin, who has said innumerable times that US foreign policy is hostage to domestic politics. He realizes that, and so any agreement he might make with Joe Biden is going to be fashioned with that in mind. Thanks a lot for your question. It was a very good one.
Thank you.
All right. My name's Calla. I work with MAPA. I'm asking the next question, but before that, I do just want to give a quick reminder to folks that if you have questions, please drop them in the chat rather than raising your hand. We're collecting them all now, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can later on. All right, so my question is also about some of the recent developments we've seen in Russia and Ukraine. So upon Putin's decision to recognize the two separatist Ukrainian republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the DPR and the LPR, I've seen a lot of Western officials like Boris Johnson, Kamala Harris, claiming that Russia is infringing upon Ukraine's sovereignty, while Putin is maintaining that he is, honoring the self-determination of these regions in eastern Ukraine. To me, this feels, a little hypocritical coming from countries like Britain, which is still occupying Northern Ireland and other overseas territories, and the United States, which is itself a settler colony and maintaining colonies in Puerto Rico, et cetera. It feels like these Western imperial powers are only ever recognizing sovereignty and self-determination when it serves their own interests. So I was wondering if you could speak to these issues and then the broader question of whether Russia is infringing upon Ukraine's sovereignty or respecting Ukrainians' right to self-determination.
This is a really good question. It's not a good idea to take parts of other countries. I subscribe to the Chinese dictum, which is very strong and perhaps the last holdout for the Westphalia Treaty provisions, which say you shouldn't invade or you shouldn't seize, you shouldn't bother other countries. Now, I think that was 1648, something like that. It came at the end of 30 years of warfare in Europe, where I think a good portion of Europeans died, something like 1/6 of all Europeans. I mean, they figured out there has to be a better way to regulate interstate relations, and that's what they came up with. Now, the Chinese still say we're against any of that kind of thing. We think borders are sacrosanct and so forth and so on, and they're saying it as late as today. Now, with respect to hypocrisy, when you look at what the US did with respect to Kosovo, and there's a very good article on consortiumnews.com this morning about that, you'll see that this is hypocrisy, magnified, because what's the difference between what we did in Kosovo in proclaiming independence for Kosovo and what the Russians just did with respect to Lugansk and Donetsk? Well, that's an unfriendly question to ask. Do you think one of the White House correspondents might ask that? I don't know. He or she might not be invited back, but that is the question. Now, from a personal point of view, if I were Putin, a lawyer that he is, if I were Putin and the coup happened while I was in Sochi at the Winter Olympics on the 22nd of February 2014, and I came home and I had a council convened, and I said, what are we going to do about this? Because NATO wants to take over Ukraine. Yatsenyuk has already said so. What would that do to our only ice-free naval port in Sevastopol, Crimea? And around the table said, well, we'd lose our main naval base in that part of the world, okay? And Putin said, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, we could seize it, would say some of the military. Putin said, well, how about asking the people in Crimea or whether they'd like to rejoin Russia. And now, that was a novel concept because the last time the people at Crimea were just adjoined to Ukraine by ukaz, by order of Khrushchev. For what reason? Nobody knows. Putin said for some reason Khrushchev had given Crimea back to Ukraine. So what are we saying here? We're saying that if I were Putin, I would have said, you know, I think maybe we ought to do a little plebiscite, a little referendum, find out how they think. And then if they want to join us, then we could make that decision. That's, that's of course what he did. They say 96% of the people voted for rejoining Russia. Seems a little high, but I've been in Crimea and I haven't been able to find anybody who voted against it. That's pretty not very scientific. But a month later, and this is what's important, a month later, namely in mid-March 2014, Putin got up and said, yes, we accept Crimea back into Russia. Their people have voted for it. And bear in mind that I did this not only because their new prime minister says that they want to join NATO, but even more important, because we want to prevent the construction of missile bases there in Ukraine. Missile bases, the ones we were talking about before. So Putin was alert to that possibility at the time. I went back and read that thing a couple of times. That's what he says as early as March 2014. We're more afraid of the missile emplacements than we are of membership in NATO, although both are important to us. Bottom line for me on the legalities of this, well, there are lawyers that can say not only Kosovo, but the recognition of independence for the Donbass countries there could be justified under certain provisions of international law. Well, it seems to me academic in the literal sense. These days, Westphalia? Who remembers Westphalia? You know, might makes right. And we don't like that, and I hate it. And there's no ABM treaty or INF treaty to fall back on or violate. But if you're in a position where your opponent, your openly declared opponent, is going to seize something that is vital for your national security, I think you're derelict in your duty if you don't seize it first, whether it was seizure or the deft way in which Putin got Crimea back. Last thing here, it's important, I think, to point out how naive Americans are with respect to all this drumbeat of a new aggression, a further invasion. Further, what's a further? What's a further? Well, further is because obviously the invasion in 2014. What invasion? Now, with respect to Crimea, I had a very poignant example of this kind of mindset. I was sitting about a year later in a very progressive meeting, and there was a professor from one of the local universities talking about how proud she was that when her 10-year-old son came back from Sunday school, he had written a placard which said, "No more deaths in Crimea, Mr. Putin." And virtually everybody in the audience said, "Oh, wonderful." So, you know, the old skunk at the picnic raised his hand and he says, "Well, what are you referring to?" He says, "Oh, all those people that Putin killed by invading Crimea." I said, "Well, how many were there?" "Oh, probably thousands." I said, "Would you believe zero?" "Oh, no, I couldn't believe zero." I said, "Well, you better believe zero. Only one shot was fired in anger and it missed." Ah, I can't believe that happens to be the truth, folks. What happened was the Russians already had 15, 20,000 troops in Crimea. They took off their insignia before anybody in Crimea in the official structure got any instructions from Kiev. They went around to the establishments and said, now look, we don't want any trouble. We have orders from Moscow, from Putin. Would you please step aside? We don't want any trouble. And they stepped aside. These were the little green men without insignia, okay? Now, it was very artful. It was nonviolent, and it was without any appreciable Ukrainian resistance. That's what they call the invasion of Crimea. Give me a break. Those troops were already there. All they did was take off their insignia. How about the invasion of Donetsk and Lugansk? Well, this is a very bitter pill because of the antecedents. On the 2nd of May, 2014, there were a group of pro-Russian people in Odessa, a major port city in southern Ukraine, and they were rounded up and chased by pro-Nazis and chased into this building. I think I mentioned this before. Many of them were burned alive. Others jumped to their death, many wounded. That was all open and all videotaped, okay? Putin made reference to that most recently. Now, that was the 2nd of May. It was only 2 weeks later, if memory serves, that the people in Lugansk and Donetsk said, we don't want to be part of this fascist-led government that is taking measures against our Russian speakers. We're going to declare independence. They declared independence, both of them, each of them, and then they went to Putin and said, would you annex us, please? We're in line to be annexed. And Putin said, no, we won't. We'll give you some help. We'll send in volunteers, or we'll make sure that the Ukrainians don't obliterate you, but we're not going to annex you. And this past week, we've heard Putin and others say, we waited, 8 years, and we got no resolution from the agreement that was worked out, the Minsk Accords, to repair this problem. So it's about time for us to prepare to recognize these people, not annex them, recognize them as independent countries, and then be able to supply them with whatever they really need. Again, I wish I knew whether the Russians are already in these new republics or not. It doesn't really matter. I imagine they will be, whether they have insignia on or insignia off.
Steve, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Hi there. My name's Steve. I'm a member of MAPPA's board, and I wanted to ask you. So in 2014, a major narrative on the Russian side was that there were Nazis and fascists on Maidan, and that narrative got ridiculed at the time. But then you think about recently, we know that Nazis like the Azov battalion are integrated within the Ukrainian security state. And I wanted to ask you, how relevant is that true, and how relevant are right-wing and neo-Nazi forces in Ukraine's institutions right now, and how much control and impact do they have over Ukrainian policy?
Well, it's substantial. The Azov battalion, one really doesn't know whether the Ukrainian military controls it. They're right up there on the demarcation line. They openly display swastikas and other Nazi-era symbols. They're very proud to be in that tradition. And they cooperated their antecedents cooperated with Hitler when he invaded Ukraine and when he decimated many Poles and Romanians and Ukrainians that lived in that part of the Ukraine. So they're a very real factor. Now, if you remember Nuland's conversation with Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, you recall she talked about Tonnybrook. Well, Tonnybrook's a Nazi. He's a right sector head, okay? And he was one of the leading contenders to be prime minister. She said, no, that would be a little too risky. We'll put him on the other side, but he's still there. I think it was made head of the security services or something like that. So yeah, it's a problem. Now, why is it a problem, a special problem for Russia? Well, I think I already mentioned that when the Nazis invaded Russia through Ukraine, at the end of the day, at the end of that war, 27 million Russians, or I should say Soviets, were dead, okay? You remember that kind of thing, okay? And you remember how the Nazis conducted themselves when they entered Ukraine and elsewhere. And you know, when Putin, who is fluent in German and who has lived in Germany for quite some time, looks at this problem and realizes what befell all these nations at the hands of the Germans. And then he hears the German prime minister, a young fellow named Scholz, say, oh, that's laughable. Well, folks, it's not laughable. It is in no way laughable. And if you want to get a sense of this, watch just parts of Putin's speech when he announced what he was going to do with respect to these two independent, naming them independent. It's not so much emotion as history. It's not so much, what do I say? He's been vilified for expanding and saying, oh no, we're going to take all of Ukraine. He didn't say that. And he doesn't want to take over all Europe like some of the advisors at the National Security Council, former, used to say. What he wants is to be able to defend his country. And what's the change? I'll just say again, because it bears repeating. Early last year, he thought maybe he could work with Biden. He met him in June and found Biden to be woefully misinformed with respect to the world correlation of forces, and then spent the rest of the year with Chinese President Xi saying, look, we got to tutor this guy. We got to tell this guy that it's 2 against 1 now. And even his generals might be able to understand that. And that's what they did. Now, last thing here, I've been making so much a point of what I consider to be the Chinese support factor, which I think made Putin feel, look, I'm not alone here. China's got my back. That's big. I'm going to go for broke, okay? Not that he's going to invade. He's going to go for broke by being really tough, okay? I've been making so much of that when the announcement came that these two republics are being recognized as independent, I knew enough about Chinese foreign policy to say, oh, they don't like that. They don't like that. Not one bit do they like that, okay? So what were the Chinese going to do? Well, as some of you may have seen, I wrote, it's anybody's guess. But I think that they'll throw their support to Russia, and they'll be very, very strong on the need for independence and for safeguarding international borders, but at the same time, they will support Russia's core interests, as both of them say, and those are, of course, to face down NATO and make sure that no intermediate range ballistic missiles go into Ukraine or Poland or Romania or anywhere near where they would threaten Russia's retaliatory capability. So what's happened? One of my, well, Chas Freeman, you probably know who he is. I consult him whenever I have a question on China, because not only is he always the smartest guy in the room, but he knows a lot more about China than I do. I said, Chaz, what do you think? He said, well, this is a tough one. I don't know. And the next day he sent me today's foreign ministry spokesman's statement about, in answer to all kinds of questions about what Russia did, recognizing two independent, what about this? And there's a formula that the Chinese foreign ministry spokeswoman, in this case, used, and she repeated it 5 times to 5 different questioners verbatim, and that was, China only approves nationally recognized borders. They think they're sacrosanct. They don't like people messing in other people's, blah, blah, blah. It's a formula. And then the last time she said, as I previously said, China, blah, 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 blah. So they'll stick to their principal position. But even when Crimea was subsumed back into Russia, the Chinese will mum about it. They didn't approve it. They couldn't approve it. It's against their principles. But they didn't say diddly about it, as we say in the Bronx. They didn't criticize it. And I think we're good in speculating that maybe we were right for once. Maybe we predicted that the Chinese would slough this thing off, would say, well, we don't like it in principle, but we understand what the Russians have done. Chinese today also made fun of sanctions. They mocked them. They said, what good are sanctions? Sanctions never did any good for anybody. What good are sanctions? So, it's not hard to see which side the Chinese are on. And what's hard for me to see is why so few recognize that this is a game changer. And it accounts, in my view, for why Putin feels very much emboldened to be assertive, asserting Russia's rights not to be threatened unnecessarily.
So the next question, I know you already touched upon the Mickey Mat. So I wanted to ask, how can we combat the Mickey Mat in order to gain peace in the world and with Russia's stability?
Well, this is the big question, and thank you for it. Who knows where the CEO of Raytheon lives? Anybody? Nobody? He lives up by your way. He lives up in the Boston area. Can you find out where he lives? I think you guys are bright enough to be able to do that. How can you let him walk down the street to the local restaurant without asking him, hey, you're making tens of billions and billions of dollars on making tomahawks, as Putin calls them, tomahawk missiles, and where your workers are being paid a pittance, and there's lots of people needing that money in our country. Why are you doing this? Now, this is just one suggestion. I just want to say that we need to get off our patooties and stop talking about what things or how things are terrible. Oh, they're awful. They really are. Well, they are awful. What are we going to do about it? Okay. Now, there's not a hell of a lot of time left. We know how our political system is not working. We know it has to do with money, profiteering on having enemies so that we can build weapons. Now, I think we're pretty smart, generally speaking. Maybe Tony Blinken isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but we're reasonably smart. Can't we figure out how to challenge the people who are behind all this? Congressmen as well, but most, I think the people who are making hand over fist from profiteering. Now, how do we do that? Well, I was up at the Columbia School of Journalism about 4 years ago, and I asked some questions at the end, as I normally do, and I found out that the head of Westinghouse, the CEO of Westinghouse makes the gyroscopes and the stuff that makes some of the drones so lethal, some of the Hellfire missiles and so forth. And I found out that somebody said, "Oh, we know him. He lives in Morristown." I said, "How far is Morristown?" Knowing that it's only an hour away. It's about an hour away. So I looked. Now, during Vietnam, there would be somebody back there saying, "I've just hired a bus. We're going down to Morristown on Saturday at 9. Meet us at 49th and 6th. But there was no one there. No one anywhere. No one would follow up on the notion that we might be able to confront this guy right in front of his neighbors and asking him why he's doing this and why he's exploiting the opportunity to deprive people who need the money more from a decent way of life." I would have to say this, that we don't have unlimited time. And the Germans didn't have unlimited time either. And yet they had some really gutsy people. Sophie, for example. But I have another one in mind, and maybe I'll take a minute to tell you about him. Some of you know about Dietrich. Dietrich. I'll remember his name in a second. The guy I want to talk about is Haushofer. Haushofer was a Geolog in the University of Berlin, which means that he had tenure. And some of you people up there in Boston, you know what tenure is, right? Okay. So he had tenure, and the way he got tenure was keeping his mouth shut, as Hitler did all these atrocities against some of his Jewish neighbors and others, okay? And finally, Haushofer had a conscience, okay? And he started speaking out against the Third Reich, and he was, of course, rounded up, and all his followers, he had assembled quite a following by that time. They were all rounded up too, and he was put in prison. This is right before the Allies arrived in 1945. So Dietrich, Haushofer was condemned to be shot. They either shot you or they hanged you. In this particular prison, they shot you. But the Nazis, of course, were very methodical. And before they would shoot you, you had to sign a confession. And Haushofer says, no way am I going to sign a confession. I'm not guilty of anything. Then he thought about it, and well, they shot him anyway, as the Allies kept getting closer. And as they picked him off the ground, they found a little settle, a little piece of paper in his pocket. What he had done was compose a confession. It was in the form of a sonnet in German, of course. And it's not very long. I think I can remember it. Let me read it to you, and then I'll translate it. Schuld, German word for guilt. Doch bin ich schuldig, aber anders als ihr denkt. Yeah, I'm guilty, but it's not what you're thinking. Ich musste früher meine Pflicht erkennen. I should have earlier recognized my duty. Ich musste schärfer Unheil nennen. I should have more sharply called evil. Mein Urteil habe ich zu lang gelenkt. I put off my judgment far too long. He did speak out, but very late. Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar. What's genug? Enough. So I did warn, but not enough. Und klar, claro. No comparative in Germany. Clear, clear. I should have warned, I did warn, but not genug und klar. Und heute weiß ich, was ich schuldig war. And today I recognize what I was guilty of. So let's think about us, folks. Let's think about us. We know enough. A lot of what I said tonight was well known already to many of you. What are we going to do about it? I would just like to add a favorite expression of mine. I call it the Noah principle. Some of you may have heard me use this. It's very brief. It's this: no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arcs. So as I see it, it's our task to find out what kind of arc we need to build in our particular part of this universe, because doing nothing is worse. Doing nothing is not a possibility given the challenges that we face. And maybe one more quote, this one from my favorite rabbi, Abraham Heschel, who said, you know, we're not all guilty, but we are all responsible. Acquiescence in evil is worse than perpetrating evil itself.
Thanks, Ray. Okay, so you gave us a lot of great historical context tonight, and we spoke about 2014 and 2022. Can we talk a little bit about 2016? Because there was this narrative that Russia and Vladimir Putin, they hacked the US election and they delivered us Donald Trump as president. And one of the central foundational points to this allegation was that they said that Russia hacked the DNC servers and gave the emails to WikiLeaks, and that hurt Clinton and helped Trump. But it was your group, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, that basically called bullshit on that and said that, no, it was an internal leak from the DNC that gave that material to the WikiLeaks. So can you talk more about that? And can you talk about the significance of Russiagate, the Russiagate allegation in regards to US-Russia relations?
Well, there's direct significance here. Putin has become the devil incarnate. Most Americans think that he's capable of anything, including, now get this, invading Ukraine, bombing the hell out of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. He's capable of doing all this. As a matter of fact, our president has been trained to say he's going to do it. He's going to do it in the next couple of days. And if he doesn't, I'm not going to meet with him. There's another key clue here, another key connection. And that is a fellow named in that intercept from Victoria Nuland, Sullivan. I'm ashamed that he's an Irishman. Now, Jake is his first name, and he's tied in with Russiagate as well as with Ukraine. Let me explain. Well, first I should say, my wife always says, Ray, for God's sake, don't forget to tell him what you think of Donald Trump. Okay, so here goes, folks. I think he's the very worst president we ever had, and I hold no brief for anything he did or says. What I do is analysis, and I look at the facts, and there are one or two cases out of 3,000 where he and I come at the facts in the same way. And one of those is Russiagate. It's about the most important subversive activity I have ever seen in our government it was before Trump was elected. It was subversive in the extreme. The subversion being done by our security agencies in the person of John Brennan. What's his name? The FBI director, the NSA director, and people in DOJ. So what happened? Well, I'll try to be brief here because this is what happened. In the middle of June, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks made an announcement. This is June 2016. He said, we have Hillary Clinton emails. We have emails related to Hillary Clinton that we were going to publish right soon. Whoa. The next day, the Washington Post had a little column saying, oh, this is probably a Russian operation. But what happened was there was a convention coming up. I think it was on the 25th or so of July. Now this was the 15th of June. Wow, that's not a lot of how. Oh, here's Hillary's Council of War. My God, what has Julian Assange got? Oh God, if he's got DNC emails, and we have some reason to believe someone leaked emails from the DNC, they'll show the whole world that we stacked the deck against Bernie Sanders, where he didn't have a chance of an ice cube in hell. Okay, this is bad. My God, and the convention is coming up, and Julian Assange has said he's gonna publish them soon. Oh God, what are we gonna do? So there's a council of war around the table, and anybody got any ideas? Yes, Jake. Let's blame it on Russia. Jake Sullivan, are you out of your head? Russia had nothing to do with this. That doesn't matter. We hate the Russians. We hate Julian Assange. We can make that stick because the media will buy it. Blame it on Russia. So Hillary looks around the table and says, anybody got any better ideas? Okay, we'll go with it. And they did. Now, the only thing I wasn't a fly on the wall there, but that I'm pretty convinced is how it went down. Whether it was Jake Sullivan or not, I just suspect it was some other inventive, imaginative staffer. And of course, Sullivan was running the campaign. So he would have had to agree anyway. So fast forward to the convention. 3 days before the convention, the emails came out and they showed, as Hillary feared, that she swiped the nomination from Bernie Sanders, pure and simple, by what they did with the primaries and everything else. It was very, very clear, okay? So the question was, how could they make this stick? Well, we have Hillary's PR manager, Jennifer Palmieri. She attests in the Washington Post to how she went around to all the TV outlets at the convention and tried to sell this story. And, they weren't really interested. And it was a hard sell. But then when we got back to Brooklyn, says Jennifer Palmieri, Brooklyn being Hillary's headquarters, then intelligence people started to come by, and then journalists connected with intelligence people. And then that week we had confirmation. No, it was the Russians. And then the administration tended to confirm that it was the Russians. Now, the first thing, of course, was the charge that the Russians had hacked the DNC and given those emails to Julian Assange. Now, what do we know really happened? We know, number one, that the FBI never investigated that, never took charge of the computer systems of the DNC. What happened? They deferred to a crowd called CrowdStrike, who was led by an old FBI employee, said that this was a very solid firm and they could depend on that. And on December 5th, 2017, the head of CrowdStrike testified under oath, "We have no technical information to confirm that the Russians or anyone else hacked those particular emails." Oh, wait a second. December 5th, 2017? Who buried that? Adam Schiff, the head of the committee before whom this fellow appeared. Sean Henry is his name. Wow. How long was Schiff able to keep that secret? Oh, from December 5th until May 7th, 2000. Oh, that's pretty good. What happened on May 7th, 2000? He was forced to declassify Sean Henry's testimony because the head of intelligence said, look, if you don't do it, we're going to do it. And so Adam Schiff did it. And of course, you read that in the New York Times, right? No. The New York Times has not published the fact that this top-rate cyber agency has said there's no evidence of a Russian hack. They had that information, as I said, on May 7th, 2000. Now it's what, February 23rd, 2002. So we're almost 2 years where I guess the New York Times is competing with Adam Schiff to see if they can keep it under wraps for that much longer. Suffice it to say that the whole thing fell apart then. What damage was done? Well, scads of Russian diplomats thrown out of their embassies. The Russians accused of all these things, sanctions imposed. I mean, if you wanted to make the Russians justifiably angry, you couldn't have done any better than this. The point is that this has an effect now on how Americans look at Russians. They haven't read the Times article on Sean Henry's testimony because the Times didn't write an article on Sean Henry's testimony. Okay, so they have no way of knowing. So what we're ended up with here is an uninformed citizenry. And I just say that, remind people that when Eisenhower warned about the Mickey Mat, actually, he warned about the MIC, right? The military industrial complex. Now it's grown like Topsy. But when he warned about the MIC, he said the only way to prevent the MIC, the military industrial complex, from accretion of power, unrestrained power that damages democracy, is an informed citizenry. We don't have an informed citizenry, and that's all very deliberate. Now, with respect to Andrew Sullivan, it's come out now that some of the well-heeled lawyers working for Hillary Clinton have been caught lying to the FBI and other people having to do with how they explain that they weren't working for Hillary Clinton when they gave the FBI rumors that, for example, Trump was in touch with Russian banks and all this kind of thing. The irony, of course, is that none of this helped Hillary Clinton win the election, but it was very, very subversive of the regular order, so to speak, in our democracy. So what about Sullivan? Well, he was right in the middle of this. And the special prosecutor has the book on Sullivan. So the worst case here is that when Sullivan's making a mockery of US foreign policy making, when he's telling the president to say, no, the Russians are coming on Wednesday. Oh, it's Wednesday too. we missed another Wednesday, okay? Or they're coming in just a couple of days, or they're going to bomb the hell out of Kiev, the capital, with 2.5 million people. I mean, so Sullivan has an extra incentive. I mean, you can call it wag the dog or whatever you want to call it, but it's not beyond a fellow like Jake Sullivan to put his own personal jeopardy in the mix here and say, wow, if we keep stoking this tension, maybe we can keep deflecting attention from what the judiciary is about to do if they have the guts. That's, of course, the big question. Does Merrick Garland have the guts to pursue the people working directly under Hillary Clinton who had to know about this perjury, had to know about these hoaxes, worse than hoaxes, actually. And does he go after Hillary Clinton herself? I don't know. I would be surprised if that actually happens. But the point is, I mean, both political parties, my friends, are corrupt to the nth degree. And I just wish there were a way to make sure that we didn't have to vote for the lesser evil each time around. Maybe you young people are smart enough to figure out how to avoid having to do that.
Steve, we can't hear you.
Keep doing that.
That's okay.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the economic front of this conflict. And Nord Stream 2 has consistently been an economic flashpoint during the conflict, and that's come to a head with U.S. and German sanctions being imposed on it this week. And so I wanted to ask you, what economic interests is the U.S. supporting by opposing that particular pipeline, and how significant has economic policy become as another theater of the conflict?
Well, economics, of course, is terribly significant. The problem is that Nord Stream 2 has been completed. It's pending approval, procedural approval from the German judicial authorities. This was always described as kind of a pro forma process. That process has been interrupted. The pipeline has not been canceled. It's not been, as I put in one of my titles, it's not dead in the water, so to speak, okay? It exists, it's there. Now, the the Germans themselves depend on Russian fuel for, I think at the latest figure I saw, one third of their oil and gas. That's a lot. What will happen if this thing is really, if they put the kibosh on it, so to speak, okay? If the pipeline is canceled, I don't know how they blow it up or whatever. They can't do that, but let's say it's stopped indefinitely. Well, the U.S. would like to sell liquefied natural gas to the Germans and everybody else, but there are only a couple of liquefied natural gas ships available. And already they're sort of lining up at ports like Hamburg and elsewhere to dislodge what they have. In other words, it's not going to work. And what the Europeans will have to pay is several times what they're paying now for their energy. So what have the Germans done? Well, the Germans have skirted around this issue, and finally, yesterday, I guess, or the day before, said, okay, we're going to discontinue the approval process. Okay, well, okay. It was going along very slowly anyway. They were slow walking it until at least the end of this Ukraine crisis. What will be the end? Well, the end will be very, very telling, because it will mean either A, the Germans wake up and start acting like adults for the first time in 77 years, and not like vassals, not like appendages, not like puppets, okay? Or they tuck tail, they defer to the United States, and then people in Germany begin to question, wow, is this really a good idea? We have not only Der Spiegel, a pretty leftist or liberal magazine, but we have Die Zeit now, a sort of rightish newspaper in Germany, saying, look, you know, it was this broken promise to Gorbachev. It was this broken promise that led to all this business about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, and how how NATO is encroached ever eastward despite the 1-inch pledge. Spiegel uncovered yet another document proving that Putin is right and that Blinken and Biden are dead wrong. Documentary evidence, okay? And so what does that make the German people believe? Wow, so we reneged on a promise. Helmut Kohl, our chancellor, as well as James Baker, US Secretary of State, we reneged on that promise. Huh. And so all this is because of that. So they're going to ask a lot of questions. In my view, it's a matter of time. I've been saying that the Germans should start acting like adults for like 2 decades now. It may take another decade, but I don't think so. I think this has brought stuff to a conclusion here. And I think that within the next year, we'll find out how the Germans react and what that means for the alliance, because the Germans are the linchpin of what's left of NATO. And if they get really disenchanted with US pressure and US sacrificing their own, that is Germans' own interests, economic interests, for their own narrow war against or struggle against Russia, and then that will be very telling. We'll have to see. I guess I have to warn you, as I do when I write about this, don't hold your breath. The Germans are very pliable, and I guess there are reasons for that. And even though I've lived in Germany for 5 years, I still can't figure out the reasons.
So, being Russian, I have faced quite a few difficulties regarding being in the United States. Like, I'm simply coming here to study and like pursue my goals. However, like being even just a student, I did face some type of discrimination. And just by being Russian, I have to apply for a visa every year. And then this year, I couldn't come back for 6 months because they were doing a whole background check for me. And on top of that, both of my parents are not allowed to come into the US without any type of reason. They don't provide any reason, they just took their visa. So what I wanted to ask you is, why is the US politics and media rhetoric in regards to Russia is so often xenophobic? And how and why did this anti-Russian xenophobia become so prevalent in the United States?
Another good question, and it's a kind of a sad situation, isn't it? The simple answer is that the Russians were the best bet for the kind of enemy that the Mickey Mouse needs. What's really amusing almost is that we had decided that China would be the main enemy, main rival. That was in the national security study of last year. Now, guess who's holding up the national security study of this year? Putin. You know why? Well, because of all the stuff he's doing in Ukraine. Now we don't know whether it's China or whether it's Russia or whether it's both of them that we're the chief enemy. I mean, that's almost laughable, but it's not really. Now, with respect to personal, Americans, by and large, see what they see on the TV. They believe that the Russians interfered, and they blame Donald Trump on Russian interference. My God, what worse could you accuse anyone of than being responsible for Donald Trump? So a lot of people have been just brainwashed, and it's easy to tap into old Soviet stereotypes as if Putin still wants to conquer the world. He doesn't still want to conquer the world. He has actively disavowed Lenin, Stalin, and many of the other people as recently as 2 days ago in that major speech. Read it. He disavows the Soviet history. Now, when he said that the falling apart of the Soviet Union was a real tragedy, well, it was from his point of view, because there were tens of millions of Russians left outside Russia now that had to fend for themselves. And some of those in Ukraine. And he's felt a patriotic duty to make sure that they're not abused as they have been for the last 8 years. Count them, 8 years. That's why he's done what he's done. And he has not felt emboldened enough to do that until he had full Chinese backing. And that's the new correlation of forces. I'm sorry about the personal aspects of this. Muslims and even some Chinese are experiencing these sophomoric or infantile reactions from Americans who are brainwashed by the media. And it's a very sorrowful thing to say. And I apologize. You should not have to go through that kind of thing.
Thank you.
All right, I have another question, and I'm really excited to ask this one because you already mentioned briefly the situation in Kosovo and sort of the US's hypocrisy in relation to what's happening in Ukraine now. But so we've heard a lot from US diplomats claiming that Russia is trying to overturn 30 years of peace in Europe, allegedly brought about by NATO. Obviously, those claims are absurd, that there's been peace and also that NATO has created any peace. But many in the West don't know the real history. So I was recently doing my research on the history of NATO, and one of the most glaringly aggressive and anti-peace actions that I learned about was the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, which was a breach of international law. It killed hundreds of civilians, caused long-term damage to infrastructure and the environment. So I was wondering if you could speak to NATO's history of military aggression and how this contributes to Russia's opposition to Ukraine becoming a member state.
Yeah, well, that's again an excellent question. And the answer is to be found mostly in that article I referred to that was atop the consortium news list this morning. I think the title was something like, what's the difference between Kosovo and what Putin did 2 days ago? Nobody knows the answer to that because there is no answer, except that they're not different. In other words, they're both illegal in one very real sense, but to have the perpetrator of the first illegality criticizing the perpetrator of the second illegality without any sense of hypocrisy is giving hypocrisy a bad name. Now, what NATO did to Yugoslavia in 1999 was just the first use of NATO in that kind of oppressive, aggressive way. And we still have one of the biggest bases that the US ever created, located right there in Kosovo. So it's part of this, this grandiose idea that we can do what we want. And that's what's been proceeding ever since we violated that first promise. I should probably tell you that I had a chance to ask one of Gorbachev's chief lieutenants why it was that when James Baker promised Gorbachev and Shevardnadze that the US or the NATO would not move 1 inch farther to the east, why they didn't get it in writing. My father was a lawyer. He always said, get it in writing, right? Why they didn't get it in writing. And this fellow, what was his name? His name will occur to me in just a second. He said, look, Mr. McGovern, there were basically two reasons, three maybe. The first one was that the Warsaw Pact still existed. I mean, here we are trying to figure out how to reorder things, but the Warsaw Pact was still there with all these satellites under Moscow's control, at least nominally. Secondly, we hadn't fully gotten German buy-in. We had some German officials saying, yeah, we're not 1 inch, but we need, before you're gonna put Germany back together, for God's sake, you need to get some sort of official buy-in from them, right? And then he looked at me and he said, but Mr. McGovern, this is hard for me to say, but in my view, the problem was we trusted you. Now, both sides since then have learned doverai no proverai, trust but verify. And I do think that there will be negotiations coming out of this craziness over the last couple of weeks that will permit some of Putin's major concerns to be addressed. First and foremost, the intermediate nuclear missiles that he would like to prevent being emplaced in Poland, Romania, and Ukraine.
Great, thanks, Ray. Okay, we have one more question and then we're gonna wrap up tonight's program. Before I ask the last question of the night, I just wanna say a couple things. In the coming days, I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered here with the recording of this talk and some resources, raymcgovern.com and some resources we spoke about. So people keep an eye out for that. We just actually had a program recently with the Jamu Baraka, and I still have to send that follow-up email. So I'm a little backlogged on the follow-up emails, but it's coming. All these great resources are coming soon. Okay, that's one thing. Ray, you introduced me to a book called JFK and the Unspeakable by Jim Douglas. It was a really great book and had a profound impact on me. That book is dedicated to Vince Salandria and Marty Schatz. Marty Schatz happens to be in the audience tonight. We did a webinar with him previously. Marty and I have created a working group, a JFK working group, where we study his speech that he gave at American University, his speech about world peace. And in that speech, John Kennedy is challenging the American public to look at Russian people differently, to look at them as human beings with legitimate concerns. And he's challenging the American public, and he's alluding to an end of the Cold War. So we think in our group that that message is still very much relevant today. So if anyone is interested in joining that group, they can just let me know. Also at Mass Peace Action, we have a no Cold War working group where we're focused on the issue of no Cold War with Russia and China. So if anyone here is interested in our no Cold War working group, they can also let me know. One of the things we're doing in our no Cold working group is we're reading this book here, War with Russia by Stephen Cohen. And if anyone wants to join our reading club, they can. We'll talk about this book on, I think it's March 30th. But anyways, Ray, so my question for you is that here in the US, we are, it's like ingrained in us that Putin and Russia is aggressive. That's like the word I hear constantly. Putin is aggressive, Russia is aggressive. Reading this book by Steve Cohen, I'm getting a different sense here. I'm getting the sense of Putin as somebody who may even be a rational actor who may have legitimate concerns. So even in mass peace action, in recent days, we've been having a discussion, a debate about our language and rhetoric in regards to this. Some of us want to criticize Russia and criticize Vladimir Putin. My personal view is I think that Americans, it's not our place as it's hypocritical and sanctimonious, I think, as Americans to criticize Russia and China. So when people use this language about Russian aggression, I mean, can you comment on this? What are your views about all this? Is that accurate or fair to say that sort of language?
Well, let me start out by picking up on Stephen Cohen. Steve was a good friend, and I'm delighted to say that he endorsed Mickey Matt. He liked the acronym, and he wrote me a little email not long before he died saying, keep that one up. This one covers everything. Now, Steve told me, it's just really wonderful for me to have friends like this. When I want to know about China, I ask Chas Friedman, or when I want to know about Russia, I ask my friend Jack Matlock, who I used to work with in Washington, or I used to ask Steve Cohen. Now, I asked Steve at one point, Steve, what about all this support for people like Navalny and other people who really don't have a chance but are being stoked by the National Endowment for Democracy and other people? What about all that stuff about, Russian violation of this, that, and the other thing? And he said, look, Ray, that's a diversion, that diverts you from the attention to the foreign policy. What we should care about is the foreign policy. To the degree that we get involved in accusing the Russians of discrimination or just being dictatorial, that screws it up not only for our bilateral relations, but it also screws it up for the people that we are seen to be supporting in Russia. And some of those are bona fide good people. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, Steve was ostracized. I mean, get this. He got some money to set up a fellowship program at some prestigious university. And when he tried to do that, all he wanted was to have the name Cohen, the Cohen Fellowship or whatever. And they wouldn't do it. He couldn't give away his money to these institutions because he was so ostracized for thinking that there shouldn't be a second world war, and there was likely to be, and that the Ukrainians had started it with Victoria Nuland and the rest of it. So this is a very, very sad situation because these are academics. That's why I have, academia think tank on the end of Mickey Matt. They get a lot of money from the government. It's all about money, and the professors there, I don't know what they're learning from these professors that obviously either hate Russia genuinely or synthetically, so to speak. But it's a sad state of affairs. And I'm trying to remember what the original question was. What do you do about it? Yeah, well, look, I'm almost ready to say to create something that says, in the equivalent of Putin is right, Biden is wrong. Then you go down. You start, if you like, in 1990, when we promised not to move NATO. That's all documented. It's all in libraries. Most recently, it's in Der Spiegel and Die Zeit, okay? So new information. And so we go down and we just take Putin's speech from 2 days ago, and we go down that speech and see, okay, who's telling the truth on this? Who's telling the truth? And, if people criticize us for being pro-Putin, well, so what? If they're not willing to read and absorb what we come up with, there is a kind of invincible ignorance. I'll just close with a little vignette about Catholic theology. There was one concept invincible ignorance. That is, if you were so ignorant of something that you didn't realize it was a high crime, you did it anyway, well, you might not go directly to hell, you might go somewhere else. So if your ignorance was invincible, now there is maybe 10% of the American people that are invincibly ignorant, but my God, we owe it to the rest of them, don't we? We owe it to the rest of them to stick our necks out and say what we know and compare it to what we hear from Washington. Now, I favor a more activist approach, the kind that I mentioned with respect to CEOs of Raytheon or other places. And I would remind those people who are as old or almost as old as I, that we have a distinct advantage. And I mean this, when young people stir up trouble and they protest and they get wrapped up and maybe they get beat up by police, and people reaction largely is that's coming to them, these young people. But when old people, when people like me get beat up, I have found out that most Americans don't like old people to get beat up. Okay. And so I don't see too many old people out there. I see a couple. There's Jerry over there. But to the degree you have that extra advantage, I would suggest that you consider putting it into play. And then maybe the younger people will say, well, hey, these old guys, they've been around a while. They think this is really serious. Let's join them. But as Cesar Chavez used to say, there are enough of us. People used to say, no, not enough. There are enough of us, but without action, nothing's ever going to happen. That's what we need to do now. That's what Haushofer didn't do until too late. That's what we need to do now to save our country, literally, because without the truth, we ain't going to be able to change things. And with the truth, there is a chance. And I may not live to see it, but that's okay, E.F. Stone famously said, those who struggle for justice and try to present just and correct information, you have to go into with an open mind, because you're going to lose. And then you're going to lose. And then you're going to lose, but one fine day, you may not be around to see it. But somebody who are just as rabid about justice as you are going to win. And I believe that to be the case. And that keeps me going. And the other thing that keeps me going is the fellowship, the collegiality that I see right here. That's just a few things on my screen here. When I used to talk in the open, I used to ask people to stand up, turn around and look at one another and see there are enough of us. What a wonderful fellowship. What a wonderful deal we've fallen into, knowing and working with such wonderful people. We may not be a majority. We have the right ideas and we have the passion for justice. And, we're going to win, whether I live to see it. You probably will. So hang in there and let's do this together.
Awesome. Thank you, Ray. So yes, everyone, please keep an eye out for the follow-up email with this video and the other resources. I want to thank everyone, especially everyone who stayed this time, for giving your time and attention and participation to us tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our co-sponsors, Community Church of Boston, Smedley Butler Veterans for Peace, and Mass Peace Action, of course. Thank you to my co-moderators, Elizaveta, Calla, and Steve, who really helped me execute this program tonight. Thank you to Ray for your analysis and your time, Ray. Ray, before we close tonight, do you have any last words you want to close us off with for tonight?
Just that it was a pleasure being with you, however remotely, that it gives me great hope to see so many good young people asking intelligent questions, and that this is pretty complicated stuff. And when Scott Ritter joined me in agreeing that there's not likely to be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, not Ukraine, but Ukraine, my comment was, well, let's not clap our hands just yet, because that might just mean that we're both wrong. So seek the truth, and maybe this is going to turn out all right. I think we need to keep the pressure on. And I applaud you for running this kind of webinar where we can get together and ask these questions, and let's go forth and educate our fellow citizens.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Thank you, everyone. And everyone, please have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.